What I thought we would do is just, as I said, begin with the Genevieve Lloyd paper. And I think for some of you it's probably quite a hard read because some of it's a bit complex. So I thought I would start by giving a short summary of what I think are the most important points, and then create some time when you talk in groups at your tables, and then we'll have a general discussion following that. Later on this morning, we'll go back to the Cartesian piece and have another session very much along the lines that we did yesterday. Okay, that'll be the next stage. And then we'll break for lunch at maybe 12:30 or so. So, Genevieve Lloyd and the Man of Reason. She's an Australian philosopher, and she wrote this article in 1977, I think it is, isn't it? 79. And it actually was the microcosm, the miniature version of a book that she published in 1983 with the same title, The Man of Reason. And that book has been influential, and I think rightly so. It's a very clear account of the way in which certain assumptions have been at the heart of the development of Western philosophy, perhaps forever, but especially in the modern period, especially since the Renaissance, let's say. And so I'd like to look through this because one of the things that's very interesting about philosophical developments is that they can sound as though they're irrelevant to ordinary people. They sound so strange when you read them. Most people can't understand what's going on. So a clear example of this is Descartes' systematic doubt. So Descartes wants to find a secure basis for reason, ultimately because he wants to show a basis for belief in God and all the other things that he holds most dear. But in trying to find a secure base of reason, he goes systematically through all the things that he could possibly doubt. So, I mean, surely I have evidence of my senses. This is a table in front of me. There are people in front of me. Surely I know that I'm in a room with other people. But of course, I could be dreaming. Because when I have a dream that I'm in a room with a table, I dream I'm touching it, and I cannot differentiate between being in the dream and being awake as I think I am now. Similarly, it's possible that all the people I see around me could just be products of my imagination, of my mind, as they are, in a sense, in dreams. So that's the thing that worries him. That's the process he gets to. Everything could be false. Everything could be unreal. It could just be that there is nothing. But the thing I can't doubt is that I'm thinking. The thing I can't doubt is that I'm doubting. Okay? That's the thing that he gets back to as the very basis. I know many of you know this, perhaps some don't. That leads him to say, he's writing in Latin, and that leads him to say, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. So what I can't doubt is that I'm doubting. That's the fundamental basis. And other than that, I don't know how I can go on yet, but at least I've found something that I'm sure of. Now, that sounds crazy, doesn't it, to ordinary people? That sounds really stupid, right? And in a sense, their reaction's right. But what's very interesting about this is that that process of doubting led Descartes to think of the mental as more real than what's out there. I've got better evidence that I'm thinking, I can't doubt that I'm thinking, than I have that there's a table there. So what's happened is that my senses have been reduced in importance and my mind has increased in importance, and my mind has been separated from my body. The mind I can't doubt, I must be thinking, but this could just be in my mind. So the mind-body separation, which is already there in Western thought in some ways, becomes accentuated, increased here. Now, it's a funny thought this, but if you look at most Westerners, in Europe or in America particularly, if you look at most Westerners in the 20th century or 21st century, most of them are Cartesian dualists. A Cartesian dualist is someone who accepts the mind-body separation. Right? None of them have heard, or most of them haven't heard of Descartes, but they are still affected by this mind-body separation. Now, if you come from Asia, you'll see how different the way Western people think is in some respects, how they have this odd attitude to their body as something that's separate from them, and how strange that is to you if you're brought up in Japan or China. Okay? So what I'm trying to show is that that crazy philosophical doctrine, that strange set of ideas, actually feeds into the way ordinary people think. Okay? Let me give you another example. In the early 20th century, in the 1920s and 1930s, there was a group of philosophers, which some of you will have heard of, called the logical positivists. And they worked especially in this country and in America and in Vienna. The Vienna Circle, so-called, was at the heart of this. And what they thought was, what they based their thought on, was an extreme form of empiricism. So they would say that the only thing I can be sure of is what my senses provide me with here and now, this present moment. So they wrote things like, Paul here now. Okay? And it's on the basis of Paul here now that I can think Paul here tomorrow, or Paul here yesterday, or Alison here now, or I can go out from that immediate moment of me here now. Me here present in a physical sense and present in a temporal sense. Okay? They based everything on empirical evidence, so that the meaning of a sentence always depended on some method of verification. Verification, showing it's true. How do I know there's a table? Well, I touch it. That's the method of showing it's true. And you would accept that I can witness the table by touching it. Now that idea of verification, that nothing is real unless it's tested, actually is there in teaching today. Teaching and learning in schools. In this country, I think in the United States, possibly in Japan, other countries as well. So there is the idea that nothing is being taught unless there's a test. Okay, so a good class, a good lesson is one where you say what you're going to do by putting 3 objectives on the board, learning outcomes on the whiteboard at the beginning, and then everything you do is directed towards those learning outcomes, and then you test to see if the students have understood those things. It's no good saying, well, I think she understood, or I had a vague idea that that person was following what I said. You must have these tests. So that's a modern day version of verificationism. And of course, the people who develop this idea, who carry out these forms of testing, they've mostly not heard of the Vienna Circle or logical positivism, but the influence finds its way through. I could give many other examples like this. So philosophy is very powerful in this respect, much more than most people would realize. So let's look through what Genevieve Lloyd has to say then about this particular aspect of philosophy. And if I give a page number, these are her words. If there are no page numbers, they're mine. So she says right at the start of the article you've read, by the man of reason, and the fact that she's using capitals clearly signals she's using it in a particular way. By the man of reason, I mean the ideal of rationality associated with the rationalist philosophies of the 17th century, precisely the century when Descartes was writing. Descartes was writing kind of 1620 through to 1650. And secondly, something more nebulous, nebulous means cloudy or unclear, something more nebulous, the residue, the leftover, the remains of that ideal in our contemporary consciousness, our inheritance from 17th century rationalism. So our inheritance from 17th century rationalism is the mind-body dualism that I was saying that is actually very common in the West still. It's not just the mind-body dualism, it's the rationalism we're going to talk about as well, of course. And then still on the same page, she writes, more is involved here than the supposedly neutral sense of man to include women. So until comparatively recent times, say the last 20 or 30 years, it was quite common to take the term man as the default term for human being. What is the nature of man, you could say. Hamlet says, what a piece of work is man, as I said to you yesterday. What's the nature of man? And then it was kind of accepted that that would mean human being. And of course, there have been objections to that, and quite rightly so, because it does surreptitiously position man in an inferior position to women, even though it's pretending to be a universal term. But what she says is that what's at stake here is far more important than that, really, because when the man of reason is extolled or praised, philosophers are not talking about idealizations of talking about human beings. They're talking about ideals of manhood. So this is the crucial thing. The kind of ideal that comes forward in this account of human being is a noticeably masculine ideal. That's what she will try to show. If you want to interrupt me at any point, please do. So she's stressing, these are my words, she's stressing the association of rationality and maleness and claims that it has classical roots, and she gives us some examples with scary quotations from Aristotle and from St. Augustine. I won't go into those, you have them in the text. Moving forward then very quickly, we come to the Renaissance, so the period around about 1500, let's say, time of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael. And just a little later, we've got Charlotte de Brachat in an attack on those who want to forbid knowledge to women, writing in 1604, complains, "These gentlemen would like to see us plain imbeciles so that we could serve as shadows to set off better their fine wits." Now, I don't know if you can follow that phrasing, but what she means is that men, on the whole, don't like clever women. They prefer the women to be there being quiet and admiring the clever things they say. They also don't like funny women. I've often heard female comedians say that men find them a problem because funny women are particularly disturbing. You know, they're not supposed to be like that. Okay. And what develops around this time then is not that women are inferior, but that women are different and that they have different virtues. And the virtues, I suppose, are fairly predictable. And this, to some extent, is also goes along with theological discussions at the time, when the particular War of the Sexes version they developed then centers on the account of creation in Genesis, the Garden of Eden story, when, as you remember, they're in the wonderful garden, they have everything they want, they have a kind of harmony in life, absorbed in what they're doing in the way animals are. And they're told there's one thing they mustn't do, they mustn't take from the tree of knowledge, which is, of course, the apple tree. And who takes it? Well, Eve is persuaded by the devil, the serpent, to take the apple, and then she gives it to Adam. So it's very easy to see that as blaming everything on women, isn't it? So we're obviously going very quickly through this. Descartes in the 17th century. The acquisition of knowledge is a matter of the systematic pursuit of an orderly method. The essence of the method is to break down all the complex operations in reasoning into their most basic constituents and to render the mind adept, skillful in performing these simple operations, intuition and deduction. Let's pause for a second. So when we talked about doubting whether there's a table before me or whether there are people in the room, it was a system of reasoning I was employing, systematic doubt or methodological doubt. So a system of reasoning going from one step to another so that none can be doubted. I'm sure of the first step. If the second step follows logically from the first, that must be true, that must be sound as well. So intuition, this is the other term he will allow, is the undoubting conception of an unclouded and attentive mind, which comes from the light of reason alone. Constant emphasis on reason, not on the senses, not on the emotions. This is the basis of Descartes' later doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. Remember that phrase, it's a very potent phrase and it's influenced so much of the development of Western philosophy, especially analytical philosophy. Clear and distinct ideas. Do you remember when I was talking to you yesterday about ethics and morality and so on, and I said that very often people like to put things in boxes. They like to make diagrams and put things in tables and boxes. Well, that's a present manifestation of this desire for clear and distinct ideas. And certainly it's desirable to be clear, to draw distinctions when there are clear distinctions to be drawn. But sometimes things are not divided up in that way. For example, well, it's not very clear today, sometimes, more in Japan than here, you have a bright blue sky, very clear-cut lines to the buildings, and so on. But sometimes you also have fog. And it's a little bit misty today. Sometimes it's very foggy in London. It was very foggy, much more foggy in the past, famously so. Fog is a real thing. So there's no point in trying to put this into a clear box, a clear category. So to think well, we need to appreciate the fog as well. So she says, deduction is the process by which we extend knowledge beyond intuitions by connecting them in series. Now, of course, the classic form of deduction is the Aristotelian syllogism. If Aristotle says, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That follows logically. It cannot not be true. You don't need any further evidence. Okay, it's a valid deduction. And if your premises, your starting points are true, your conclusion must be true as well. That's the way that Descartes wants to proceed. These are the only mental operations then that Descartes would admit into his method, but the proper understanding and use of them, he thinks, will yield all that lies within the province of knowledge. So there's this massive faith in this process of reasoning. Anything else is in fact an impediment, a barrier to knowledge. And he writes, nothing can be added to the pure light of reason which does not in some way obscure it. And Lloyd carries on, the method is universally applicable regardless of any difference in subject matter. So we've got a method of reasoning which will apply throughout our lives, across all subject matter. A modern day version of this might be the faith that's sometimes placed in critical thinking as a kind of abstract ability that can be applied in all subjects. And you might like to think about whether that's a reasonable thought or whether in fact what you need is different kinds of criticism, different kinds of thought according to different kinds of subject matter. So we must not fancy, this is Descartes again, we must not fancy that any one kind of knowledge is more obscure than another, since all knowledge is of the same nature throughout and consists solely in combining what is self-evident. What you probably notice here is the very powerful metaphor of light, bringing things to light and clarity. And I think this again is a Western thing. It's there in a sense in Plato with the metaphor of coming out of the cave, where you see illusions and shadows, coming out of the cave into the light and looking ultimately towards the sun. It's even there in the Western word phenomenology, because the first part of that word is the root for light, as in phosphorescence and other words like that. So all knowledge is of the same nature throughout, and it consists solely in combining what is self-evident. So Descartes thinks that he's uncovering the unity of all knowledge and that thought is all of one kind. And furthermore, there's an isomorphism, a matching of thought and reality, so that my hands are isomorphic, they mirror each other, don't they? Okay? So thought and reality works like this as well. If I say the bottle is on the table, the sentence the bottle is on the table matches the state of affairs in some way. So isomorphism between reason and reality And the basis of this is a God who wants to allow us to see truly. Okay? Veracious means truth-telling or trustworthy. And this gives reason itself an almost divine character. Because if you're reasoning well, then you're in tune with the truth, and the truth is what God provides. So reason is God imbued. That means something like soaked in God, steeped in God, okay? Soaked in God. And it provides the divine spark in man. Again, it's a light metaphor, spark, isn't it? Divine spark, something coming to light. And we go on. Genevieve Lloyd writes, the vehicles of knowledge are clear, precisely bordered mental states, sharply separated from one another. So it's no good saying that morality and ethics kind of blur into one another. We should be able to put them in clear boxes. They should be clear and distinct ideas. That's the way this might manifest itself. It's not what I think. And Descartes says, the distinct is that which is so precise and different from all other objects that it contains within itself nothing but what is clear. So we have chairs and tables and cups and bottles, all clear and distinct objects. The fantasy is that all reality is like that there isn't fog, there isn't a blurring of one thing into another. And the absolute certainty which accompanies clear and distinct ideas derives from their purely mental character. See how that reinforces the mind-body separation and downgrades knowledge through the senses. It derives from their purely mental character. Intuition, as Descartes puts it, is free of the fluctuating testimony of the senses. So the senses, touching the table, provides me with evidence, testimony, doesn't it? But of course that evidence is unreliable because I think I'm touching the table when I'm sleeping, and sometimes I might see water on a hot day. I might see water down the road on the surface of the road, but of course it's an illusion. It's a mirage. There's no water there. It's an illusion of the light. So the testimony of the senses, the evidence they provide, is unreliable. It fluctuates. It comes and goes. And the blundering constructions of the imagination, well, of course, part of my thinking does encourage me or involve me in imagining, but often what I imagine are completely false things. The mirage I just mentioned, the water on the road, will be an example, and think of all the other fantasies and stupid ideas that people have. So blundering constructions of the imagination, just think of Donald Trump again. Blundering means pushing in, knocking things over, being clumsy, not working out things well, and making mistakes. So Cartesian method is essentially a matter of forming the habit of distinguishing intellectual from corporeal matters. Corporeal means bodily, so always the priority for Descartes is with the intellectual. This is the serious thing. Don't be deceived by your body. It's a matter of shedding or getting rid of, removing the sensuous from thought. Don't be led by your senses, be led by your reason. Constant downgrading of the body. So, Genevieve Lloyd takes us forward quite fast. I'm certainly not going to cover everything she talks about. There's quite a long section on Spinoza, who's a complex 17th century philosopher, and I think that what she says there doesn't do justice to his thought, but it certainly shows a greater richness in Spinoza than she finds in Descartes. So I'd rather leave that because I think it will take us too far away to try to do that now. And what she does is to show a little bit more about Descartes and especially the attitude to women, and that leads into certain influences on Rousseau or certain elements in Rousseau's own writing. So she writes, also it now becomes possible, as it was not before, to have a reasoned basis for assigning the emotions, the imagination, the sensuous in general, to women as their sensuous area of responsibility. So even if in the Renaissance you're allowing that both women and men might be equal and be treated to be accorded similar importance, the fact that rationality has been so clearly given this masculine quality, and the body has been rejected, and the imagination and emotions have been rejected from that masculine image, what happens next is that they're thought to be peculiarly feminine qualities or responsibilities. Okay? So the sharpening of this divide between the mind and the body now gets mapped on to the difference between men and women. And perhaps there are obvious reasons why this happens, to do with childbirth, for example, but that in any case is the way the thinking goes. And Genevieve Lloyd identifies aspects of Rousseau's book Emile, written in 1761, which caused outrage in Mary Wollstonecraft, pioneer in the women's movement. And the outrage comes from the fact that after Rousseau has provided you with an account of the upbringing, sort of ideal upbringing of a boy, Emile, he then says, well, he'll need a mate, he'll need to find a woman somehow, and he invents the character of Sophie, and he describes the upbringing that she should have. He rushes through this towards the end of the book, and he says things that would surely horrify us now. He says things like this: to be pleasing in his sight, to win his respect and love, to train him in childhood, to tend him in manhood, to counsel and console, to make his life pleasant and happy. These are the duties of woman for all time, and that is what she should be taught when she's young. So Sophie's education as a child includes things like singing and dancing to entertain her husband, learning to speak nicely, learning to listen to him and be sympathetic, learning to support his views. So of course it's laughable now. I sometimes read this and I think Rousseau was laughing too, because he rushes through this at the end. It's so ridiculous in comparison with the attention he's given to Emile. But I mean, I'm not defending it. Plainly it's extremely sexist and would fit in with the earlier views we were talking about. That's not the end of Rousseau, and I'll go back to Rousseau if you want to hear more later. So Descartes says, Genevieve Lloyd again, she's quoting Descartes, "True philosophy teaches that even amid the saddest disasters and most bitter pains of a man can always be content, provided that he knows how to use his reason." So you see the uncompromising faith in reason. If you can reason well, then you'll overcome hardship and sadness, you'll deal with disasters, all will be well. Intuition, ratiocination, and authority. Now, ratiocination is a word that comes from the Latin ratio, rationality and so on. It's obvious, I suppose. But when we add that extra suffix, ratiocination, it kind of throws the emphasis on these logical steps of reasoning as a kind of technique you would deliberately employ. It sharpens that aspect of reason. Now, the word authority has come in for the first time. Part of what the thinkers in the Renaissance period thought, through Descartes in the 17th century and into the 18th century, was that they were overcoming blind obedience to authority. And the blind obedience might be, in Europe it would be to the church in particular, not a blind obedience to simply what the Bible says or what the priest says, but a reasoned relation to religion is what they wanted. And similarly, it's a move from the feudal to more democratic or reasonable systems of government, where you do not simply do what the king says or what the local duke or squire says. You do not simply do that because they say it. There must be some reason backing this. And similarly, your own judgments about the world should be formed through judgments you form through your own reason, rather than just because you've been told something. You don't just accept things on authority. And yet, in the fully developed Cartesian method, the one he gradually refines, intuition any immediate perception of something becomes circumscribed or limited by a process of ratiocination. You've always got to be reasoning through why you hold a particular view. And intuition becomes something the mind has to train itself to do, something it cannot be relied upon to do on its own untrained initiative. So the systematic doubt that I worked on, that I showed you earlier on, is something you could teach someone to do, and their mind wouldn't be working well until they'd been taught to do this. And they would only work well, they would only think well, if they were followers of that method. So the method acquires the authority. It's not a matter of an individual's unique voice or perceptions. We become subservient or subordinate to the authority of the method. So it becomes a legitimate question to ask, have I really managed to bring off in the approved manner a clear and distinct perception? Have I really obeyed the principles of reasons? And as soon as I say obeyed the principles of reasons, you can see there's a sense in which authority comes back. And with this arises the possibility of doubt about the reliability of reason itself. So authority, supposedly exorcised with the break from tradition, exorcised, that's what you do when a house is haunted, for example. Suppose there's a ghost in the house, you have a religious ceremony to get rid of the ghost. And we've got the film The Exorcist, of course. So authority, supposedly exorcised with the break from tradition, rears its head within method, intruding its demands into the inner recesses of consciousness itself. So you start to think that you're not really thinking for yourself, you're simply obeying the rules of reasoning. That would be the worry now. This is how you must think if you wish to attain truth. So Descartes begins with an emphasis on personal autonomous knowledge, the development of one's own judgments in a direct response to reality, untrammeled, uncomplicated by appeals to authority. Yet Cartesian method itself shackles intuition, ties intuition down within a method for knowing, a method in which the mind must be trained. So we move on to the 18th century, and in the 18th century, which is a key stage in the Age of Enlightenment, isn't it? Like the epitome of the Age of Enlightenment, we need to see what's said there. Well, there's huge faith in reason, but also something else gradually develops. There is also a revaluation of the emotions. In the 17th century, the passions were characteristically seen as a source of disorder and falsehood. Thought was the essence of the mind. The passions were seen as intruding distractions and disturbances resulting from the mind's union with the body. So the thought is the closest thing to you. Those passions, those things you feel, are like a further extension and are not so close to you. Though not necessarily disapproved of, they were seen as, at worst, threats to purity and, once again, clarity of thought, and at best as confused modes of thought itself. They were to be either transcended and kept in subjugation, subordinate to reason, or else transformed by reason into higher modes of thought, refined, sublimated. So the 18th century saw a defense of the passions. Passions just means feelings or emotions, of course. A defense of the passions as well as the springs of action, as the well springs of action, as the sources of action, with reason providing the means for achieving the dictates of passion. So there's a reversal to some extent now. The passions, the emotions, the feelings matter, but they must be controlled by reason so that they're directed to good ends. We mustn't simply give in to them. So David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, would be a key person expressing such ideas. And Immanuel Kant has a very complex account of this, where reason has the upper hand, but he acknowledges the passions in something like this relationship. And towards the end of the 18th century and through the first half of the 19th century, especially in Germany, to some extent in France, and in this country, we have the development of the Romantic movement. So in the Romantic movement, there's a challenge to the supremacy of reason. And the Frenchman Condorcet, who was killed in the Terror, as you read in the article, how consoling for the philosopher. I must tell you, he's speaking very sarcastically here. How consoling for the philosopher who laments the errors, the crimes, the injustices which still pollute the earth and of which he's often the victim, is this view of the human race emancipated from its shackles, released from the empire of fate, and from that of the enemies of its progress, advancing with a firm and sure step along the path of truth, virtue and happiness. So can you hear he's being sarcastic, darkly sardonic in what he says there? Because of course he's living at the time of the French Revolution and the Terror, the terrible killings that followed afterwards. And he died then. So into the 19th century and the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Frenchman Henri Bergson. And what does he have to say? Well, he's an important figure here because his affirmation of intuition is not a repudiation or rejection of rationality, but it's an attempt to get beneath the segmentation of thought, the compartmentalization of thought, involved in clear and distinct thinking. And he also wants to get below the spatialized, discrete representations into which 17th century rationalism has carved up reality, cut it up, put it in boxes. It's an attempt to grasp duration, the passing of time, free of the spatializations which that form of reasoning has imposed on consciousness. Let me interrupt. So one version of time is like this, isn't it? It's a long line, like a railway line with various stopping points or stations on the way. And of course, if you look at your watch, that's exactly the conception of time that you're working with. What Bergson tries to sensitize to us to, is the fact that we actually experience time in different ways. Because, right now, you're sort of thinking what you'll do later on today. You're anticipating what you're going to do later on today, or you're anticipating where you're going to go this evening, or when you're going to go back to Japan or China, or wherever it is. And you're also remembering what you've just done, which gives some sense to why you're here now. So you're very much not a person who is simply here now in the present moment, in a way perhaps the birds in the trees are. On the contrary, you're someone who's always coming from somewhere and on the way to something else. And it's in this kind of experience of time that sometimes time goes very quickly and sometimes it drags. It's in this kind of relation to time that we're bored, for example. You see? So he takes very seriously that genuinely very human relation to time, and he shows that really by the rise of modern technology we've been deceived by the chronological time, the time that's stretched out in a line. Of course that's real, we use it, we need that, we work with times of the clock and the calendar, but it's a mistake to think that's our only way of thinking about time. And there's also an East-West difference here, because on the whole, Western thought wants to think of a timelessness. So in Christianity, time will come to an end, and then there'll be heaven forevermore, and so on. And the West wants to understand things in abstraction from the changeability of the world. Plato's thought reaches towards timeless forms. I can explain more of that if you're not familiar with it. Whereas Buddhism, at least, is very much attuned to time, to the way that things come into being and pass away. And many Buddhist practices are closely involved with temporal activity, aren't they? A temporal relationship. So the last part there then, what Bergson wants to do is to grasp the continuities, the continuity of having done just this today, now about to do that, and then tomorrow that. There's a continuity of flow there. He wants to grasp that rather than think in terms of this moment, this moment, this moment, in a series of successions. She also makes a reference, which may have escaped some of you, though it was much more topical at the time, to this book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Obviously a very original title. Can I just see how many people have heard of it? Apart from Jeremy. Sorry. Yeah, just about, 3 or 4 of you, okay. So it's a book that was written in 1970 what? Do you know? I can't. Yeah, I'd guess 74 or something like that. And it's a really unusual book. It's worth reading. And it's about a man and his son going on a holiday together. I think the son is about 12 or so. And they go by motorbike through South Dakota and North Dakota. And it's a kind of journey of exploration, of self-discovery. And in this journey of self-discovery, they have to stop various times because he attends to the motorbike that's not working so well. So the care for the motorbike, the working with the machine, and being on the way somewhere, remember what we said yesterday about being on the way, those are also all crucial to this experience that he's talking about. The whole experience is described also as being a kind of Chautauqua, if that's the right expression. Chautauqua is a Native American word that means something like a journey out, a journey of self-discovery. Okay. It's worth reading, and it's directly philosophical in that there are aspects of it that refer to Plato, to Poincaré, the geometer, and it's very, very thoughtful about the nature of human practice. And we're getting towards the end now. She writes, "It's easy to see the man of reason as just the post-17th century variant on the historical role of male oppressor. But men and women are jointly responsible for his continued status as an ideal of rationality. Men and women are responsible, for he represents women's ideals too. What is needed is critique of his standing as an ideal, whether as an object of male self-esteem or female envy. The impoverishment of woman through the imposition of sexual stereotypes is obvious. Exclusion from reason has meant exclusion from power." But she also says this, "The corresponding impoverishment of men is rather less obvious, for what they miss out on has been downgraded. What is needed for the man of reason is realization of his limitations as a human ideal, in the hope that men and women alike might come to enjoy a more human life, free of the sexual stereotypes that have evolved in his shadow." Okay, so perhaps that was a bit obvious to some of you, but I hope it's helped you a little bit in drawing attention to the most salient points from this for the course we're now doing. Can I ask you just to sit at your tables and talk to one another about your impressions of, well, what I've said, but in particular the article as well, okay? Perhaps an extra question for you would be this, that she's writing in the late 70s, so we're, 35 years or so on from there. How much have things changed? How far is this conception of the rational man still dominant in some way? This conception of reason dominant? And you might like to think about that in relation to education today, as I was trying to do at certain points. Okay?